So overlanding, like life, is full of a lot of ins and outs, a lot of what have yous, a lot of bumps along the way, and you might be thinking that something to put an end to those bumps, at least smooth them out a little bit, might be something you want to add to your vehicle. So one fairly popular option that you could do is you add basically a second set of shocks that only come into play when you hit a bump really hard and like the truck goes off the ground and then it comes back onto the ground really hard in a maneuver they call, in the parlance of our times, sending it. But all cars do already come with bump stops, and if you're wondering if you need them, I do have a little story to tell you to illustrate the importance of a bump stop. So my first car was a 1979 Jeep CJ7, and I bought it and I drove it home. We had those gutters that kind of go ba-bump when you pull into the driveway. Well, when he pulled into the driveway, it was like ba-bang, and it was metal from the axle was just slamming right into metal from the frame, causing a huge clang. And if the windshield hadn't already been broken, that might have done it. So I discovered that there's a little pad on the CJs, there's a little pad on the axle, and there's a little pad on the frame, and there's supposed to be a little piece of rubber between there. Well, I was I just was a kid in high school and didn't feel like spending the $5, $10, whatever it was to buy that piece. So I just shoe gooed a tennis ball into place there. And that worked okay. Until the tennis ball lost all its air and then fell out. So then I went around and I found one, and it's literally just a bolt with a piece of rubber on the end, and you put the bolt through and you bolt it down, and then the problem goes away. So now I have this 2017 Tacoma with perfectly good factory bump stops already installed, but I had the idea to put Timbren Active Offroad Bump Stops to improve the ride, stop the bumps, and really tie the truck together. Now there are lots of videos here on YouTube that'll go through all of the step-by-step guide of how to install these things. It's really not that hard. So I'm just gonna spend most of my time talking about the main question here, which is, do you even need them in the first place? But first let's go inside. It's crazy cold out here. All right, it's much better in here. So assembly on these bump stops is pretty self-explanatory. I don't really have much to add above and beyond what others have said here on YouTube. So we'll just keep talking about, what these do and why you might or might not need them. First of all, this is the stock bump stop. So it's a piece of rubber attached to a piece of metal, and it just sits underneath the U-bolts on the stock setup. The kit that I got the Timbren kit with the U-bolt flip, and so on this vehicle the U-bolts are square on top and they point down with the nuts on the bottom, and there's a plate down there, but they hang down a little bit farther, it's like that much farther below the axle. So if you flip it, they go up, and all you have is just the shank of the bolt as it turns around the axle. So I think that's certainly worth doing. You get a little bit more clearance. Of course, the first thing you do is you jack up the rear end, and the tires and the wheels come off, and then you need to take the lower bracket off that holds the springs on, and an impact driver, an air impact or electric impact driver will make pretty short work of that part. So this is where the central question comes into play. If you look at the stack height of the bump stop and the little cradle that it sits on and the flip plate, there's barely enough room for all that to go in between the axle and the truck. So I actually had to get the jack out and sort of jack it all up a little bit farther to get it in, which is kind of necessary, because if you're doing the U-bolt flip kit, then those U-bolts are pointing up, and you've got to get that impact driver in there to torque those down. Now you could use a ratchet if you hate yourself. So once you've got those U-bolts torqued down, then you can slip that U-bolt plate on there and put those nuts in, the bolts in, and bolt that down. Now, as you can see, once I actually lowered the vehicle down off the jack stands, there was very little room between the bump stop and the frame. And when you put the rooftop tent on and any kind of load in the vehicle, then it's actually sitting on the bump stops, and now your suspension is the bump stop.
Do you even know how to jump on
So, should you install the Timbren Bump Stops on your Tacoma? Well, that depends. If you have a stock Tacoma and you do carry a load, no, you should not. If you're carrying a load on the stock Tacoma, it's going to sit down there right on the bump stop or right above the bump stop, and you're going to hit it all the time. If you just use the factory bump stop, this thing here, then you're going to have like that much more space before you hit the bump stop. And the suspension, and you'll hit the overload spring, and the shocks will most of the time prevent it from even touching the bump stop. And the rest of the time, it'll be a minor little bump right at the end of the travel, and you kind of really don't notice it. Lightning Dragon and I went on a trip to shoot some video for Roxor, one of my clients, and we took the Tacoma with the rooftop tent and stock suspension and these stock bump stops up and over Sunrise Pass down in the Pine Nut Range. And you know, we had the cooler, we had a lot of weight in it, and you know, I know I was hitting the bump stops a bunch, but it wasn't really that big a deal. If you're lifting your truck and you want to minimize those harsh bottom outs, should you get the bump stops? Maybe. I mean, it won't hurt. If you're lifting the truck so that it's not regularly coming into contact with those bump stops, then yeah, I mean, it'll be nice. And when you do occasionally hit those bump stops, it won't be that big a deal. And especially if you're lifting your truck, chances are you need to limit the suspension travel anyway for those new shocks. In the long run, we are going to lift this Tacoma a little bit more, so some of the issues that we're having with these bump stops will sort of go away. If you're thinking about getting these, if you're going to lift the vehicle more than 2 inches, 2.5 inches, then yeah, you're probably not going to have a whole lot of issue with these contacting a lot. Certainly if you're going 3 inches or more, then it'll be nice, and you'll probably really need the extra bump stop. You will notice these bump stops in everyday life, particularly if you drive through parking lots with speed bumps. With the stock bump stops, you know, you'll hit them, and right at the last second, you'll hit the bump stop, and you might notice it. With the Timbren bump stops, you'll have just a tiny little bit of suspension travel, and then it'll be all bump stop from there. Like every speed bump, you'll feel a little bit of soft, and then it'll get rubbery, and you can definitely tell that it's rubbery. So if you're just kind of leaving it stock, or just want to you know, take up a little bit of the weight that you have in the vehicle, I would get overload springs, honestly, and not these bump stops, because you're probably going to be sitting on those bump stops most of the time if you have a load in the vehicle. For now, I hope this helps you decide if you need or want the Timbren Active Offroad Bump Stops on your Tacoma. If you thought this was helpful or useful, hit the like button, and if you really want to see more of this stuff, hit the subscribe button. And if something I said was stupid or incomplete, or you know, maybe particularly wise or insightful, then hey, hit me up in the comments for that action.